Well, hey there, colleague. How in the world are you doing? My name's Dave Stewart Jr., and I'm delighted to be your guide in this talk about the science of learning. And let's just see if from this science we can pull some principles that may perhaps apply to all the work that all of us do in education. So the bulk of this video is going to be a series of brief talks that I gave back in 2020 here at my own school district. I've edited these to make them applicable to the things that you and I face today in 2023 and hopefully well beyond. But just if you get confused about why I'm dressed like this in one video and dressed like this in another, it's because it's a series of talks. And then at the very end, I'm going to give us some broad principles that I do believe apply to all the work that we do from these things in the science of learning that we are going to discover together now. All right, let's dive in. What are kids like? How do they learn? The way that we answer these questions matters a lot. These are fundamental questions about education and working inside of it. And no matter what your role, the way that you answer these influences how you do it. All of us believe things about what children are like and how they learn, and we come to this from a variety of sources. So, for example, some of us approach this artistically, some of it as craftspeople. Others really emphasize the degree to which our journey and experience teaches us about children and how they learn. And then still others of us draw heavily upon science. What we want to do is to focus in on this bottom right-hand corner. We want to ask ourselves, what is the science of learning that is being talked about more and more at the national level? Why might it matter for us? How does it actually connect with what we're doing? So I hope that by the time we're done with the next few minutes, you and I will be really clear on what we mean when we talk about the science of learning together. And then it won't be like this yucky or unclear term that we just kind of miss each other on communicatively. So it's first really important for us to be clear about what kind of science we're talking about when we talk about a science of learning. There are two types of science that are frequently discussed and confused with each other when it comes to discussing the science of learning. And I want to make sure that we don't do that because it'll just get in our way. So one kind of science that gets talked about a lot are empirical generalizations, okay? These are things that in a variety of contexts and student groups and task types and experimental settings, scientists observe again and again and again and again. So these are really consistent observations. Empirical generalizations describe what science has kind of settled on. And that's a huge benefit of empirical generalizations. They're settled science. So we don't have to be too uncertain about whether or not they'll be disproven anytime soon because they've been so consistently observed. A big problem with empirical generalizations, though, is that they only apply to a single aspect of super complicated situations, like, those situations that exist anytime that you or I talk with a young person and try to help them to learn. That is an amazingly complex situation, and empirical generalizations only tell us one thing about that situation. So that's a pretty big weakness. Now, the other kind of statement that we have to understand are theoretical statements. So theories take a big old cluster of empirical generalizations and they try to put them together into something coherent. And this is really important, scientists make theoretical statements so that in an effort to predict what the outcome of future research might look like, okay? So they create coherence out of all these little kind of isolated empirical generalizations, and then they do that so that they can make a path really for the science to explore in the future. So a big strength of theoretical statements is that they integrate and coordinate all these disparate observations that scientists have made in the science of learning. And that's good because chaos is not friendly to the human mind. And when we're confused, we tend to go focus on something that we can understand. A big weakness, though, with theoretical statements is that scientists use these to predict. And so as a result, they are sometimes wrong. Let me give you a really famous example that I'm positive you probably learned about in your educational psychology classes back in the day. So this is the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. And Piaget, back in like the 60s and 70s, famously observed that the children that he was working with it seemed that their cognition developed in stages. And so Piaget's theory of cognitive development was basically that there's a really concrete stage of cognitive development, and then this pretty abrupt and rapid transition happens. And now students are able to engage, for example, more abstract thinking. So this is a really widespread concept in education today. And the only problem with it is that it's wrong. After Piaget's death in 1980, scientists started to observe, they started to develop experiments to test Piaget's theory that cognition doesn't actually move in these discrete stages with these really short transitory moments where the stages change. And so this Piaget's theory of development is just an illustrative example of why we don't want to depend so much on theoretical statements as we do on empirical generalizations. When we ask ourselves, what are kids like and how do they learn? And we want to bring science in to inform how we answer that question. Clearly, the things that we want to emphasize are empirical generalizations. So when we look at the science of learning, we're going to just examine empirical generalizations. That means we're just going to look at the things that describe reality, describe what kids are like, describe how they learn. Hey, before we dive into this week's empirical generalization, let's just establish why we're talking about empirical generalizations to begin with. Here's the gist. Empirical generalizations are not really debatable. This isn't something that, you say, well, I just don't really see it that way. Okay. Theories have debatable aspects to them. They are a little bit speculative, and as a result, parts of a theory could be right or wrong. It just depends. The science is still out. There's still exploration happening. Empirical generalizations, on the other hand, are things that have been observed again and again and again in differently replicated studies. So some of the studies have been directly replicated and found similar or the same data, and some studies have been conceptually replicated and found similar or the same data. And so it gets to the point where scientists say, all right, we don't have to study that anymore because it's kind of decided. We can generalize that this is the way that things are with this particular phenomenon. Okay, that's the stuff that we're talking about. So I want to introduce this by saying that you're really smart. Yeah, you're really smart. And I'm really smart too. We're both intelligent people. We could probably have amazingly in-depth, intricate conversations and collegial arguments about teaching and learning and young people in schools, and we'd have a lot of fun doing it. But you and I probably couldn't have a very great conversation about cricket. Maybe you're secretly a cricket aficionado, but I'm a cricket dummy. I have never watched a full match. Heck, I've never even watched an inning. I've hardly watched an at bat. The closest that I've come to watching a cricket game is in the amazing Bollywood film Lagan, which I strongly recommend that you take a look at this weekend because it's truly a masterpiece of cinema. But I digress. My point is that I'm not good at telling you about cricket strategy. I can't analyze whether or not the referees or the umpires or whatever, whether or not they're doing a good job. I can't tell you who the good teams are. I can't tell you what I would do if I was a cricket player or coach. Can't give you nothing. My thinking is as basic as it could possibly be. And if you and me have a conversation about cricket, we're going to get bored and you're going to get annoyed. So what the heck's going on? I just said that you and me are smart, and it's true. We could have these amazing critical conversations about teaching and learning, and it's true. But we can't about cricket. Why? Because critical thinking is not a skill. What? Yeah. Now, you might know that, but a lot of people, I mean, most people in the United States actually don't. This is not a well-known phenomenon. That's why we're going with it first. So you probably are aware that, since about the year 2000, especially once
once the first decade of the 2000s got underway, there started to be all this literature about 21st century skills. We've got to make sure that young people are equipped with 21st century skills. And so there started to really be kind of an obsession about this. And in any list of 21st century skills, almost always you see critical thinking up near the top of the list. And it was like, oh, yeah, you really need this for the 21st century. It's super important. I mean, it's a little silly because you've actually always benefited from having all of these skills all across human history, especially if you were in an elite class. So I guess what the 21st century skills movement was really getting at is that we want all students to have access to these skills because, unlike in the past, you really need these in a wide variety of contexts. Okay, point taken. But it still wasn't really a new idea. As far back as 1983, in the Nation at Risk report, the National Commission on Excellence in Education said not enough 17-year-olds have higher order thinking skills, AKA critical thinking. And so by the 90s, practically every state in the US had some type of law or initiative or policy that said teachers needed to teach critical thinking. And so books like this one by Robert Marzano and Daisy Arendado taught teachers how to teach a whole number of sub skills inside of critical thinking. There was just one problem with these programs. They didn't actually work. I mean, after all, just a decade later, there was all this hubbub about how we needed to make sure that schools were teaching 21st century skills. And the problem here is in thinking about critical thinking as something that's sort of like riding a bike. Once I teach you how to, for example, avoid a bias in your thinking, you'll be able to do that in any domain at all. Once I teach you how to be open minded and look at all sides of an issue, you'll be able to do that no matter what circumstance you find yourself in, just like if I teach you how to ride a bike. That way of thinking, it turns out, is flawed. Dan Willingham summarizes it like this when he says that after more than 20 years of lamentation, exhortation, and little improvement, maybe it's time to ask a fundamental question. Can critical thinking actually be taught? Decades of cognitive research point to a disappointing answer. Not really. What? Let's look at some of the studies and two basic ideas that will help us to unpack why cognitive scientists are so sure of this conclusion. So, big key idea here, number one, is that thinking and knowledge, so the stuff that your ability to think and reason and the stuff that you know in a domain, they're tied together. They're intimately woven together. They're inseparable. You can't take them apart. So a lot of times we talk about knowledge, content, like it's grist for the mill. Okay. The mill is our critical thinking ability. And a lot of times in a lot of education books, even, you'll see people talk about, what matters is that you teach kids how to think critically. It's not what they think about, it's that they think in a certain way. So the thinking is the mill in this conception of learning, and the content knowledge is the grist for the mill. But actually, that's not how it works. It turns out that the mill is actually partially made up of knowledge. The more that you know in an area, the better your mill is going to be. So it's not the grist, it's not the flour that comes out. It's part of the actual apparatus. Let's look at a couple studies that demonstrate this. Okay, so in this one, researchers took American students and Chinese students, a bunch of college kids, and they gave them a couple of puzzles. So here's one of them. A treasure hunter is going to explore a cave up on a hill near a beach. He suspected there might be many paths inside the cave, so he's afraid he might get lost. Obviously, he didn't have a map of the cave. All he had with him were some common items, such as a flashlight and a bag. What could he do to make sure he did not get lost trying to get back out of the cave? If you want to take a crack at this one, now's your shot, because I'm going to spoil it right now. Okay. The solution is you got to put sand in your bag and you got to leave a little trail of sand while you explore the cave so that you can follow the trail of sand back out of the cave. Hansel and Gretel style, right? So here's the thing. Here's what the researchers found. 75% of American students were able to identify the solution, but only 25% of Chinese students. What? The researchers' hypothesis was that it was because of the Hansel and Gretel folk fairy tale, whatever. And so this repeated exposure as children for American students, made it so that when they saw this problem, they didn't see caves and sand and treasure hunting. They saw the deep structure of the problem, that it was a problem about going into an unfamiliar place and being able to find your way back out again by leaving a trail. They saw the deep structure, the researchers hypothesized, because of their knowledge of Hansel and Gretel. To test their hypothesis, they gave another puzzle, kind of like this one, except it was based on a Chinese folktale's deep structure. And sure enough, they found that 75% of Chinese students were able to solve this one, and only 25% of American students. That's pretty cool. So this is let's look at another study that kind of demonstrates that critical thinking is interdependent with your prior knowledge. So in this one, they took physics novices and physics experts, and they gave them a bunch of physics problems to look at, and they said, "Hey, sort these out for us. Would you sort these out for us?" The novice students ended up sorting things out based on their surface structure. So these are problems that have springs in them, and these are problems that have inclined planes. The physics experts sorted the problems totally differently. They did it based on the deep structure of the problem. So these are problems dealing with the first law of thermodynamics, and these are problems dealing with the second. Prior knowledge completely changed how the groups saw the problems in front of them, and it changed the way that they thought about the problems themselves. Let's look at one more study before we move on to our next point. So in this one, researchers wondered, if you take the top chess players in the world, but you don't give them any time to play chess, what will happen? So in blitz chess, you only get 5 minutes total to play your whole game. It's crazy. I don't even understand how people do that. And they kind of thought, well, maybe this will completely throw the top chess players off because of all the reasoning that they're not able to do. What was crazy is that it didn't really change the results. The top chess players in regular chess ended up being basically the top chess players in blitz chess. Researchers' hypothesis from this is that what expert chess players are actually doing when they play is less a result of slow reasoning and is more a result of pattern recognition, which is hugely dependent on prior knowledge. And this helps to explain why some researchers estimate that expert chess players are actually just people who have tens of thousands of memorized board patterns in their mind. And so because of all this prior knowledge, they're able to quickly analyze the board. Like before they even are able to think about it, they see how to work the board. Okay. So all that we did with those studies was try to demonstrate the idea that thinking and knowledge aren't separate things. They're not, one of them's the mill and the other one is grist. They're both the mill. Okay. I only want to look at one other key idea here, and that's that since knowledge aids thinking, knowledge also aids learning. Prior knowledge makes it easier to acquire further knowledge. Let's just look at two studies and then I'll be done. I promise. I know this is kind of long, so I hope you're listening to me on like 1.5x or something because I'm kind of a slow speaker and I apologize. All right. So in this study, researchers took a bunch of students and they tested them on their prior knowledge about electric circuitry. And then they gave them 3 1.5-hour periods of time to play around with an electric circuitry simulation on a computer. Basically just open exploration and play. What was cool is that the people who had more circuitry knowledge to begin with ended up gaining more circuitry knowledge from the open-ended play. Researchers noticed that people who had circuitry knowledge at the start were able to design better experiments with the simulator and draw better conclusions from the results of their experiments. So if we think back to this big list of critical thinking skills, notice how some of the items on this list are really dependent on knowledge. The more you know in a domain, the better you're going to do at, for example, gathering relevant information, because how do you know it's relevant if you don't know anything about the domain? Let's look at one more. So in this one, this is a real world example. And this is also from a much longer time period. So it's kind of a unique study. So in this one, researchers took a bunch of college students in the middle of the college basketball season, and they had them take a test on their basketball knowledge. They then said, go out, live your life. We'll see you in 2.5 months. 2.5 months later, they brought the participants back and they asked them how much basketball they had been exposed to in the preceding 2.5 months. And they tested them on how much new basketball knowledge they had gained. So, an unsurprising result is that the students who knew more about basketball before tended to watch more basketball during the 2.5 months of the study. That's not super surprising, but it is actually kind of intriguing when we think about motivation and how it connects with prior knowledge. Let's save that for a different week. But the cool result is that when they controlled for level of exposure to basketball during the 2.5 months, the students who knew more about basketball to begin with retained more new basketball knowledge through their exposure than the students who knew less prior to the 2.5 months, but had the same level of exposure. So, in other words, both of these studies demonstrate something that is commonly called the Matthew effect, which is based on a line from Jesus in the book of Matthew, where he says, to him who has more will be given. In other words, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's super important because we're basically describing a, yeah, I don't want to call it a cheat code for learning, but it's kind of a big deal that critical thinking is inseparable from knowledge, and the more knowledge you have, the better you're able to think about learning, and therefore the more that you're able to learn, and therefore the better you're going to be able to so like the Matthew effect is a super big deal for us understanding things like the achievement gap. All right, but I've already said too much. So all that we've been exploring here is the generalization that critical thinking is not actually a skill, is something interdependent with knowledge. Part 1B. So, what do we do with this fact that critical thinking is not a skill? And I don't just want us to listen to some random high school teacher's thoughts. So, I'm going to defer to Daniel Willingham, who in this article gives his 3 top recommendations for schools and teachers to put into place based on the reality that critical thinking is not a skill. Okay. And before we move in, I hope it goes without saying, but I realize that it might not. Critical thinking absolutely is something that we should ask students to do. We should ask them to problem solve, think outside of the box. We should teach metacognitive strategies. All those things, there's a lot to be gained from those types of things in school. All that we're trying to make sure that we do is not think erringly that critical thinking is something that you can have without knowing stuff. You need domain knowledge. All right, so how do you get it? Practical application number 1, fact learning should be meaningful. Here's something that cognitive scientists know. Information is often withdrawn from memory just in the same way that it went in. So you don't want students to just memorize something by rote, which means with zero understanding of meaning, because probably all they're going to be able to do is reproduce it with zero understanding of meaning. So back when my kids were really little, we taught them our address, but when they were really little, they don't actually know what an address is. So it was just rote knowledge, okay? But with a little bit of teaching and demonstration and driving them through the roads and explaining them over time, that knowledge can quickly become inflexible knowledge, which now is useful. They can think a little bit with it. They can't do big picture flexible thinking. Okay. They can't find their way to our house from like Grand Rapids using our address, but they're on the path to being able to use that knowledge flexibly. So to use an example from school, let's say I, as a world history teacher, want my students to have these dates in their memory. Well, first of all, before I learned about the cognitive science of how knowledge and critical thinking are connected, I would have looked at this list and wanted to throw up in my mouth because, why would you ever want kids to just think in terms of a list of dates? But the reality is that if I can get kids to know these dates off the top of their head and know a lot about
what happened, what they signify, who was involved, what were the causes, what were the effects, how do they fit into the big picture, then all of a sudden, I don't have kids just with random little dots of knowledge in their head. I have them with these really rich schema, so that when something like 1776 is referenced by a politician or a newspaper columnist or on social media, they have all of this stuff that immediately comes to mind that they can now think with about that piece of information. All right. And I guess I should just say before I move on that schema theory is a theory because we don't actually know, we actually don't really know what a memory is. It's kind of weird. But schema theory is, I think, a really useful construct for trying to understand how this stuff works in our head. It's probably not completely accurate because no theory is completely accurate, but yeah, and that's just an aside. So point one is that we want students to think about meaning while they're learning facts. Think about meaning while they're learning facts. And the second point is really important and related, and it's this idea that knowledge acquisition can be incidental. And in fact, it most frequently probably is. So I learned this the other day. The average college freshman knows about 60,000 words. They have a 60,000 word vocabulary. I mean, they don't use all of those actively all the time, but they can recognize 60,000 words. Okay, let's imagine what it would take for a college freshman to memorize through studying that many words. Well, I didn't do the math, but this other guy, Robert Pondisio, did. And he said that you would have to memorize 10 new words every day, starting at the day of your birth, in order to know 60,000 words by the time that you were a college freshman. Well, none of us do that. No college freshman did that as soon as they came out of the womb. And that suggests that indeed knowledge acquisition can be incidental. And it works a lot like this. You are the teacher and you are telling a story to your class about something that happened to you last summer. And you say something like, my throat was desiccated, dry as a bone. I needed a drink of water so badly. You say that and your students say, or they think, that's kind of a neat word. And they now have gained this word, or at least a sense of this word. They've started to build a little bit of word knowledge about this term desiccated. And this isn't pure conjecture. In one study done by researchers at Temple University, a group of preschool and kindergarten teachers were observed, and the degree to which their students developed vocabulary during their classes was related to, they found a significant relationship between vocabulary acquisition and the complexity of teachers' language during morning message and small groups. And this is because, partially, probably because, researchers are pretty clear that memory is a residue of thought. In other words, students tend to remember the stuff that they actually think about. And this is why you're going to be so much better off, we all will, our kids will, if we give our students knowledge-rich learning experiences that are drenched with the amazing knowledge about the world. So think a biography of the life of Frederick Douglass and not a, empty little timeline. This biography is going to probably produce much greater degree of knowledge acquisition because of how much incidental learning will take place. You don't have to give students a massive list of vocabulary and, quote, drill and kill them. You just need to give them a lot of opportunities to gain knowledge incidentally. That's one thing that you can do. All right. Now, the final recommendation that Willingham makes is that knowledge learning should start as early as possible. And this really goes back to the Matthew effect, right? We probably all saw that presentation at some point in our young life. Not enough of us took advantage of it, but the idea that if you start investing, at a very young age, your investment has such a greater opportunity to compound over time. And that's basically how knowledge works too. In his recent letter to shareholders, which is full of folksy wisdom and is surprisingly interesting to read, Warren Buffett has this line where he says that all that's required to be successful in business is the passage of time, an inner calm, ample diversification, and a minimization of transactions and fees. And we could almost say the same thing for a K-12 curriculum. All that's required is an amply diversified and knowledge-rich curricula with a minimization of distractions and fluff, and then the passage of time and the inner calm required for us as a collective body to focus over the long term. The thing is, creating a curricula that builds on itself over time, sequentially, cumulatively, and is appropriately knowledge rich is a gargantuan undertaking that I can't even imagine how to pull off. And so, this is the type of thing that I think it makes a lot of sense to look for organizations and experts who have done this heavy lifting for us. It's outside of the scope of what we as individuals can affect, but those are things that we can continue to look forward to and advocate for. So we've looked at three things. We've looked at the recommendation that fact learning should be meaningful, knowledge acquisition can be incidental, and knowledge learning should start early, preferably on the very first day of school. I'd like to do an awe protocol for this. Yeah, because we're having a good time together, right? I like this, all of us learning together. So this is a time-tested protocol that I invented about 14 minutes ago, and it goes like this. Please share in the discussion one thing that you'd like to act on based on our series so far, or one thing you'd like to argue with, or one thing that you're still wondering.
Previous videos they give you just things to think about. That's really what this stuff does. It gives you things to think about in your practice, and it can influence PLC conversations and instructional decision making and all types of things. But today we're going to look at a new one. We're going to look at how comprehension, understanding what we listen to, understanding what we read. Comprehension isn't really a skill either. And by skill, we mean something that you improve at primarily through practice. Comprehension is a little more complicated than that, basically. So in this way, it's kind of like critical thinking, which we've been looking at in the preceding videos. I'm going to use Daniel Willingham's work heavily. Also, the book The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler is like a book length treatment of this idea that reading comprehension is not primarily a skill. It's not primarily something you get better at through practicing reading comprehension skills. Okay. All right. So to just begin, reading is most simply conceived of as this simple view of reading, which has been around since the mid 80s. And in the simple view of reading, there are two things that you're doing while you read. One, you're decoding text and turning it into words. And then two, you're comprehending what all those words and sentences and paragraphs mean. And probably the most famous illustration of the simple view of reading is this Scarborough's rope. So the bottom part, that's the decoding, word recognition. These are things that you want to systematically teach and give students enough practice in so that they can become fluent. So this is kind of a skill. This transfers all over the place. Decoding does. But comprehension is super dependent on the domain that you're in. Comprehension is not super transferable. So for example, in this passage, you can probably pause the video and read this out loud just fine, because decoding is a transferable skill. But I mean, if you're talking to me, I'm not a big statistics background guy, so I'm going to really struggle to have a conversation with you about what this passage is describing. And you might too. And that's because if you don't have a bunch of domain knowledge in statistics, comprehension of this passage is super hard. Comprehension isn't this broadly transferable skill. It's domain dependent. And that way it's kind of like critical thinking. And this isn't a big problem when you're having a conversation with somebody, because when you're having a conversation with somebody and they say something that you don't understand, you can interrupt them and you can say, okay, hold on, explain that real quick. But when you're reading something or when you're listening to a lecture or a video or something, then you can't ask those questions. And so you really are dependent on how your comprehension processes these things, how they kick in. And that's dependent on domain knowledge. All right, I think I'm talking in circles. So just quick illustration. In this passage, the guy is sad because his belly is protruding and he got an invitation for somebody's black tie event, and he hasn't worn his tuxedo in 20 years. The writer is not telling us a bunch of things in this little example. Not telling us, for example, that John had gained weight. It doesn't say that. Not telling us that he was worried it would fit. The writer is assuming that we can figure that out, that we can infer those things, that we know about tuxedos and middle age and, how your body is not the same 20 years after your wedding typically than it was at the wedding. So the writer is doing what writers always do, which is assuming a certain degree of background knowledge. And we often don't realize this as people who have quite a bit of domain knowledge all over the place. Like most people don't know how much they know. And so when these processes happen for us, they're pretty invisible, these comprehension processes. But for our students who do lack broad background knowledge in many domains, it's not as invisible for them. And basically, what this illustrates is an important key idea that processing of your reading, processing of your listening is slower when you're reading or listening about something that's unfamiliar. This study gives an example of that. So they took groups of people and they gave them two different passages. One passage described 4 diseases that are really common, and one passage described 4 diseases that are really uncommon. So, for example, typhus. And then they tracked the eye movements of the people reading the passages. And what they found is that the second passage with the unfamiliar diseases and terminology was much more difficult for readers, as measured by their eyes continually going back and rereading past sentences, their eye movement slowing down because they had to kind of churn through this text. It's sort of like a lawnmower going through, grass that hasn't been cut frequently enough. Not that I would know anything about what that's like. And this will get us to kind of our core nugget idea of why reading comprehension is like this. Why is it that processing slows down when we encounter something unfamiliar? And it has to do with working memory. So working memory, I learned about in educational psychology classes, but I don't think until the past few years have I really seen how relevant an idea working memory is to not just my classroom instruction, but also even my talking with my children who are ages 8 through 4 and teaching them just informally at home. Working memory's finitude is a really critical concept for understanding teaching and learning. So let's just quickly demonstrate this. I want you to read through the list that follows. You're going to want to pause the video maybe. And then after you read through it one time, cover up your screen and see how many of the letters that you can write down from memory, okay? So there's the list. Pause me and do what I just asked. Okay, now, how'd you do? Chances are you got 7, maybe 5, 6, somewhere around there. The average is 7. And this is one of many ways that researchers have determined that our working memory, the place that we're actually able to think with, okay, the site of awareness and thinking, our working memory is limited. There's not like huge variation amongst people in the size of your working memory. It can be slight variation. Maybe you've got 5 slots in yours, and I have 4 or something, but it's not like the variation is not massive. And what this means is that when we're looking at a list like the list that I had you look at, you can do some of the letters, but eventually there's just so many that you start to experience, can't remember all these. I'm trying to hold them in my head, but I can't. And, for you and me and for a child, that's really frustrating. When we come up against working memory's limits, we experience that as frustration, as fatigue, as I want to go do some other task right now that's easier. And that's a pretty natural response to working memory being overloaded. Huge implications for student motivation and learning in just that alone. But take a look. Let's see how knowledge can start to change this. So now do the same thing with this list. You're going to read it one time and then see how many of the letters you can recall. Go ahead and pause me. That list is a lot easier for people. And it's a lot easier for people because we've all got background knowledge about CNN, the FBI, CBS, CIA, and the NCAA. And that background knowledge enables us to automatically chunk these letters. We chunk them right up. It's the same exact list as the other one. It's just that the chunking is obvious because they're all in those those sensible little packets for us. And so now we can fit them into our working memory pretty easily, all the letters. And for many of us, there's even extra room in our working memory for added playing or thinking or wondering. And obviously this is like an arbitrary task. There's not much thinking and playing and wondering that we're doing. But let's consider, this will be the final thing, the famous baseball study, which has to do with reading. Okay, and let's try to connect it all together, and then I'll let you go. So in this study, back in the late 80s, researchers took middle school students and they gave them a standardized reading test. So picture half of the students are poor readers as measured by the standardized reading test, like the M-step or whatever. And then half of the students are strong readers, poor readers, strong readers. Okay. They also checked their baseball knowledge. They had them take a baseball test. There are some poor readers with strong baseball knowledge and some strong readers with poor baseball knowledge. They looked at those things and then they gave them this exercise where they had to read a passage describing half of an inning of a baseball game. And then they paused in their reading at various points and they used a little model of a baseball diamond to explain to researchers what had just happened in the passage. So basically it's a pretty robust comprehension test that they're having to do about this baseball passage. Well, I'm sure you can already guess what happened. The students who were poor readers, as measured by the state standardized test, when they read this passage, they outperformed the strong readers, so long as it was the poor reader group with strong baseball knowledge and the strong reader group with weak baseball knowledge. So this baseball study is famous because it illustrates in kind of a memorable way that reading comprehension is not necessarily a skill. And you might be thinking, but dude, that's like the state reading test that said that they're good readers or bad readers. And the state reading test is really important, and it just kind of got this. Like, I want to encourage you to ask questions and wrestle around with this, play around with this, because those types of things are things that we have to wonder.
Well, hey there, colleagues. How in the world are you doing? I hope you're doing well and are excited for yet another week of the science of learning, the SOL. Before we start, I gotta just make a confession that I hope is a helpful confession. So I've been getting a little bit overwhelmed with the science of learning lately. And if we think about the working memory image that we saw in our last video, it kind of helps me to make sense of how I feel. All these different studies and generalizations and new terms and terminology. When I bury myself in this stuff and try to grow in my knowledge and ability to think with these tools, I find myself eventually getting to this point, kind of like the guy here in the cart, where I'm just like, I've kind of had it, and I feel this big sense of disorientation, like I don't even know what I know anymore. I can't keep it all straight, and so on. And I want to just surface that, because often I find what's beneath it for me is this thought process that I have to understand all of this stuff in order to be a good teacher. Okay. And I just want to bring that up because I think all of us need to be asking ourselves, do we really though? So if you find yourself getting, overwhelmed at all with this, if you can relate to what I'm saying, I just want to say it's so important for us to, as we learn about new things in teaching, have the attitude of an improvementist, not a perfectionist. You and I are never going to completely understand everything that we would like to about teaching and learning, but we all can improve in our understanding of teaching and learning. Okay, public service announcement over. Let's get to the goody goodness of today. Okay. Last video, we looked at how comprehension is not really a skill, not in the sense of it's something that you get better at primarily through practice. All right. And that's a really non common idea. It's much more common in educational circles to talk about things like reading comprehension as one of many literacy skills that we want to give our students a lot of practice at. And the more practice we give them at this skill of comprehension, the better they're going to be. And by the way, when I look at examples like this, we're not poking fun. We're not trying to be, arrogant or have a superior attitude. We're just trying to say this is a very common way to think about reading comprehension in our country. It's even when you look at the type of data that we get back from our tests, that's data that say things like students need to work on finding the main idea. That right there suggests that reading comprehension is primarily a skill, and it's not the case. So the question is, should we even be doing things like asking students to find the main idea in class? Should we have practice and instruction in reading comprehension strategies? I mean, after all, if we're saying that these things are primarily byproducts of knowledge in a domain, shouldn't we just spend all our time with knowledge building and no strategy instruction at all? The answer to that is that we should spend some time with comprehension strategy instruction. We should, but there are some things we need to understand if we're going to do it well. So if you want to deep dive into this question of when and how should we do reading comprehension strategies, Google search for this article and you can go super deep. I'm going to try to give a top level overview of the points and studies brought up in this article so that you can, think about it in less time than it takes to read the whole article. So our focus here is going to be how and when should we teach comprehension strategies. All right, so in that article by Daniel Willingham, Willingham cites very prominently the work of the National Reading Panel. This is a landmark study put together and published in the year 2000. And in just one section of the National Reading Panel report, the researchers on this subcommittee looked at every single study on reading strategies that was published from 1980 to 1998, every single one. And then they threw out about half of them because they either were not peer reviewed and in scientific journals, or they didn't show a causal relationship. They showed instead a correlational relationship, like better readers are more likely than poor readers to use reading strategies. So they threw out stuff that wasn't really good, basically. Okay. And here's what they found. They found that strategy instruction helps. Reading comprehension strategy instruction does help. There are three basic types of reading comprehension strategies, the study authors argue. One type helps readers to monitor their comprehension. Another type helps readers to relate sentences to another. And the third and final type helps readers to relate sentences to prior knowledge. And so of these different types, the National Reading Panel report lays out the strategies that do have a strong amount of evidence to support their use in a classroom setting. In other words, these things are effective at improving reading achievement. And you might see over here that one of them has inconclusive research, and that just means that there's not enough data. The National Reading Panel found there wasn't enough data to come to a conclusion either way. So it's still likely helpful in a setting. We just don't know for sure. We don't have enough data for them to make that conclusion. Okay, but there are some caveats, really important caveats. So first of all, strategy instruction helps if you're already a fluent decoder. You remember Scarborough's rope, and two things go into reading. This is also known as a simple view of reading: word recognition and language comprehension. When you're an early reader, like kindergarten through third grade, you are still establishing this automaticity, this fluency with word recognition. And so when you sit down to read a text and you're still developing this, this is an example from our last video. If you're reading this, you've only got so much room in your working memory. And so just like what the actual words are is using up all of your working memory. John's, that's like a chunk of my working memory. John's face fell. I'm using up all my working memory on just word decoding, word recognition. And so if you give me a strategy to try to use, okay, class, let's use context clues to determine what protruding means. Well, now all of a sudden I'm
I'm already just using all my working memory to try to decode. And now you're having me try to use this extra strategy, which I don't have any working memory space for. And so I get frustrated. So strategy instruction doesn't make much sense at third grade and below because most of these students are still developing fluency in decoding. So, what you really want to knock out of the park in third grade and below is a systematic and cumulative approach for teaching students how the code of reading works so that they can become fluent and automatic in word recognition. But Dave, what about what you said a few videos ago, which was that we want knowledge learning to start as early as possible for our learners so that all of them can benefit from the Matthew effect? What's up, man? Well, yeah, totally. You don't just want your early elementary reading instruction to focus on word recognition. You also want to have a knowledge rich curricula all across the school day that allows students to learn lots of stuff about lots of stuff. And you want this to be systematic, cumulative, sequential, so that as a student progresses through their schooling, the ideas that they get to learn about grow and build on each other over time. But the thing is, when kids are really little, you want a lot of that knowledge acquisition to be happening through listening. So listening and learning is what some of these curricula call these parts of their lessons. Listening and learning is a predominant mode for learning when word decoding is still becoming automatic. Reading comprehension is slow to equal listening comprehension in learners. Long way of saying that you don't really need to spend much time with reading comprehension strategy instruction prior to the end of third grade. Okay. And then, even once you do get to fourth grade and beyond, strategy instruction doesn't need to be super long. This is amazing because it means we have a bunch of time that we can save. So, strategies, according to the research, are learned pretty quickly. All right. So, they really don't need to be overdone. You don't have to teach students 20 different times how to decode, how to figure out the meaning of words based on context, or how to ask questions of a text. They don't have to be asked that like 20 different times. In this study, researchers found that there was really no difference in reading achievement growth from reading strategy programs that were 6 or so sessions long and reading strategy programs that were as long as 50 sessions. So that means there's no reason why you would want to spend those extra 44 sessions when you could do the same thing in just 6. And this is just like 6 periods. So you could do 6 sessions on, let's just say, figuring out the meaning of an unknown word from context in fourth grade. And really, you can kind of be done with that strategy. Okay, so let's unpack why that is. Why is it that more quantity of practice with this reading comprehension strategy doesn't produce more reading comprehension? And it really comes down to the fact that comprehension and critical thinking aren't skills, meaning they're not generalizable things that you get better at just through practice. They're also the byproduct of what we know in a given area that we're reading about or trying to think about. But Dave, that doesn't totally line up because you just told us that the National Reading Panel found that strategy instruction does help reading comprehension. Not tracking with what you're stacking, man. There seems to be some inconsistencies here. Yeah, I know, totally. So here's what Dan Willingham concludes based on this, what appears to be a contradiction. He says, strategy instruction reminds you to do the things that it's about. It reminds you, in the example we've been using, to use the context to figure out the meaning of unknown words. But it doesn't enable you to do those things because in order to, again, in our example, figure out the definition of a word based on context, you have to know what all the words in context mean, right? And how the sentences all relate to each other. So strategies remind you, they're like tricks that remind you to do a certain thing. So let's take a look at an example from science. Really popular acronym in science. This is from sciencelessons.rock.com, I think, is CER, claim, evidence, reasoning. And this is a great reminder. If you want to make an argument in science, you want to remember to state your claim and then back it up with evidence and reasoning. So CER, when you give students some instruction in that, give them a little practice in that, you're going to increase the likelihood that they'll use CER, but you're not going to increase their ability to do it, because their ability to do it is still going to be contingent on what they know. If I don't know anything about plant biology, then I'm not going to know what evidence to use to support my claim in plant biology. I'm not even maybe going to be able to arrive at a claim because I'm just still too confused. And I won't know how to use reasoning to connect my evidence to my claim because I don't know very much. CER reminds me to do it, but it doesn't enable me to do it. Another example in mathematics would be checking your work. Having students learn that checking their work is a way to ensure that they get a correct solution to a problem is a very good thing to teach students to do and to give them practice doing. But checking your work doesn't teach you how to solve the problem. It just increases the likelihood that you're going to do something that is very good to do in order to ensure that your problem solutions are accurate. Okay, just a couple more quick things. Who benefits the most from teaching these reading comprehension strategies? So let's say that in 6th grade, we decide that the focused reading comprehension strategy for the year is going to be asking questions after previewing a text. It's a great strategy. Who's going to benefit the most from this? Well, there's 3 basic types of kids that you're going to have in a given class. Some of them will be those who've already discovered the strategy on their own or something like it. They're not really going to benefit from strategy instruction because they already remember to do that thing. Okay. Some of them are going to be not yet at that fluency level with word recognition. And so they're going to be working memory text too much so in order to use the new strategy. So they really won't be helped by the new strategy instruction. But absolutely, the folks who have not discovered the strategy yet, but are fluent in word recognition, they're going to benefit from the strategy instruction. And we just want to remember that this should be brief strategy instruction. 6 times or so in the school year is fine. And we can spend the rest of our time in other fun and exciting ways. Okay. And the last thing that I want to point out before I ask you some questions is this insight from Willingham that I think is really cool. Willingham says that probably the biggest benefit of having brief strategy instruction, or we could extend this out, I think, and say brief critical thinking skill instruction, like critical thinking strategy instruction, like CER in science. Probably the biggest benefit is that you're encouraging a new view of reading or of learning. You are communicating to students through your lesson, through what you're teaching them, through how you're teaching it. You're communicating to them that reading is a thing that you do to understand things, to understand the author. It's not just a school task. And that is deeply empowering and deeply motivating for a reader. Eventually, of course, all adults figure that out, right? Because none of us draw story maps or make, plot diagrams as adults. We figure out that the point of reading is to understand. But Willingham argues you might as well make sure that students figure it out ASAP through brief, targeted strategy instruction. So I have some questions for you to consider responding to. For my literacy colleagues, how much time does your curriculum currently ask you to spend on reading strategy instruction? Are you doing a dozen or so make an inference lessons per year? What does this video have you wondering or noticing about that? Is there maybe some tweakage that you see that could be made? I don't know if tweakage is a word. And what other applications are you seeing? For my other colleagues, maybe who are not primarily responsible for literacy, you get to think outside of the box here. What connections do you see between this material that we've talked about in this video and then the others, between those things and what you do? What are you wondering? What applications are you seeing?
Well, there you have it. Some basic, trustworthy findings from the realm of cognitive science. And now to conclude, I ask you this. What does this have to do with what you teach? Whether you're teaching our youngest learners or our oldest learners, science or social studies, phys ed or physics, how does this connect to the work that you do? A couple of principles come to the surface for me, and I want to share those with you now. First of all, this idea of working memory being limited. It is so important for us to maintain student engagement and student motivation that we understand that our students can only focus on so many things at a time. So one thing to ask yourself is, how distracting is your classroom? How distracting is the vibe of your room? Are the walls covered with things that could distract students? Is student behavior an issue? And now maybe you want to approach that issue from the lens of cognitive science. How do I help my students to better self-regulate, knowing that they're harming each other's working memory when they're blurting things out? This is a problem in my own class right now, by the way. How, when I introduce my students to a problem or a task, can I make it so that there's only so many things that they're having to think about? How do I, when I give my students, let's say, a science scenario, how do I maybe a little word bank or something to help kids to wrangle with unfamiliar terms that some of them may not know? The limited nature of working memory is so important for us to continue to grapple with as we create learning experiences for all of our kids. And then next, this idea that knowledge is power. Again, no matter what you teach, what grade level of student, it is so important to create a knowledge-rich environment for your students. Even that one study where the teacher in morning meeting just spoke in a more elevated way and the students had a more sophisticated syntax and vocabulary by the end of the year. It is not difficult to increase the knowledge richness of our classes, but we do have to intend to do it. But for every unit that you teach, what are the 10 most important vocabulary words? Are there any dates or facts or principles that you'd like your students to memorize? And you can help them to memorize these things through just warm-up activities each day or games that you play periodically, things like Quizlet or Kahoot. But knowledge is emancipatory. It's empowering. It enables students to experience the world in ways that apart from it, they will not be able to experience it. It helps them to solve problems. Remember the Hansel and Gretel example? And so on and so on and so on. So I hope that you've found this talk interesting, these ideas stimulating, and that you find yourself encouraged to go out there and keep doing the great work that you and I do in education. Take care, colleague. I'll see you next time.